Cedar Glen had a gray morning. The rain fell like a secret being told. The wipers on Officer Tran's patrol car moved in steady arcs, making the neon from the only gas station and the old broken high school sign look fuzzy. Atlas, her German shepherd partner, sat tall and still, his dark eyes following every tiny movement outside the window. These quiet patrols were familiar to Julia. Her thoughts were as heavy as the rain, and each drop was a memory she hadn't chosen. Atlas's ears perked up as they crept past a lonely bus stop. He let out a low, urgent whine and scratched at the window, which was an old, silent code between them. Julia slowed down and narrowed her eyes. A little girl was there, half hidden by the broken bench and a foggy morning mist. The girl, who looked to be 7 or 8, was curled up with her small hands gripping her knees. She was shivering in a thin sweatshirt that was too big for her. Her pale face was covered in brown hair. Old and new bruises were all over her arms and cheek, and they looked shockingly bright against her skin. Julia's heart started to race. She had seen suffering before, but the way this girl was completely still and seemed to be holding herself together by force broke through her usual defenses. She slowly stepped outside and spoke softly. "Hey, darling, I'm Julia. I work for the police. Are you hurt?" The girl jumped. Her big, haunted blue eyes moved from Julia to Atlas and then back again. Atlas stood in front of Julia, ignoring the rain. He was completely still, with his head tilted and his eyes soft. The girl's lips shook. Then, out of nowhere, she slid off the bench, crawled a short distance, and put her arms around Atlas's neck. Her face was lost in his fur. Julia's throat got tight. Atlas stood still, as if he had been waiting for her all night. The girl's voice was difficult to hear. "Please, it hurts too much." Julia knelt next to her without touching her. "You're safe. Nobody is going to hurt you now." "What's your name?" No response. Atlas felt a shudder go through him from the child, and he pressed closer, resting his big head on her shoulder. That quiet exchange of pain and comfort, old wounds meeting new ones, settled between them. Julia's training took over, and she looked for clues. Next to her was the child's small backpack. It was ripped and leaking a strange fluid that smelled like chemicals and was sharp. Julia's eyes got bigger. The bag displayed industrial warning symbols, including a skull and crossbones, the word flammable, and a code number that she recalled from her previous hazardous materials training. The girl was in danger, and not just from the person who hurt her. She grabbed her radio. "Dispatch, this is Tran. I have a minor injury, maybe some injuries, and I've been around dangerous chemicals. Please send a medical response immediately to the old bus stop located at the intersection of Oak and 5th. Atlas's body went stiff, and a growl came from his chest. Julia looked where he was looking. A dented pickup truck was parked across the street, right next to a flickering streetlight. The engine was running. Julia saw the outline of a man through the rain-streaked windshield. He had broad shoulders, was hunched over, and was staring at them. One hand on her holster, Julia moved between the girl and the street. She whispered, "It's okay," even though her heart was racing. "I'm here. Atlas is here. No one is going to take you." The lights on the car went out. The truck moved slowly, with the tires hissing in the rain. Julia tensed up, but before she could do anything, she heard sirens in the distance. The ambulance was coming quickly because she had called for it. The truck sped off into the gray, leaving behind only taillights that could be seen in puddles. Julia let out a shaky breath. In a matter of seconds, paramedics rushed in. The girl wouldn't let go of Atlas, so Julia and the dog got into the ambulance with her. They were wet and cold, but they wouldn't leave her side. Atlas stayed close to her, quiet and alert. The smell of chemicals was so strong that Julia was worried about her lungs. The ambulance's bright light revealed the child's severe injuries. She had chemical burns on her arms, old bruises on her legs, and her lips shook from more than just being cold. Julia held the girl's hand tightly. She whispered, "You're not alone." The girl looked at her with a blank look on her face. The rain hit the windows hard as Cedar Glen disappeared behind them. It was still early in the morning, but Julia felt something change inside her, an old pain waking up and a protective anger rising. Years ago, she saw her son alone in a world that pretended not to see him. He was scared to talk. She leaned in and said, "I promise I won't let anyone hurt you again." Atlas took a soft, steady breath, as if he were making the same promise. The girl squeezed his fur and closed her eyes, trusting the warmth next to her. In that moment, between the storm and the sunrise, 3 lost souls found each other and held on to the hope that someone would listen this time. The ambulance pulled up to Cedar Glen Memorial Hospital, red lights reflecting off rain-soaked pavement. Julia, her uniform still damp, followed close as the EMTs rushed the stretcher through the double doors. The little girl's grip on Atlas never loosened, his massive shape pressed beside her on the gurney, refusing to be separated. Nurses exchanged glances. Police K9S didn't belong in ERs, but no one tried to move him. Julia's badge and the girl's tears said everything. The ER bustled with early morning emergencies. One broken wrist, a coughing toddler, an old man with chest pain. But the little girl drew all eyes. Her silence was louder than any scream. She clung to Atlas's neck, trembling with every voice, every beep, every metallic clang of equipment. A doctor in blue scrubs leaned in, voice gentle. "Sweetheart, we're here to help. Can you let us take a look at you?" But at the first touch of cold stethoscope, the girl jerked away, face contorted with fear. Atlas whined, laying his head on her shoulder, his tail flicking slow and steady. The dog's presence calmed her just enough for the staff to work. Julia stood guard at the door, watching the scene unfold. The nurses cutting away the girl's damp sweatshirt, the doctor's gentle hands finding the bruises and burns that covered her thin frame. Beneath the grime, the girl's skin was marked by old wounds layered with fresh, some in the shape of a man's hand. Julia's jaw tightened. She scribbled notes, voice brittle as she recounted what she'd found at the bus stop. A nurse called softly, "Her name's Ava. We got it from her backpack." Julia's heart twisted. Ava. A name to hold on to. It made everything more real. The exam revealed what Julia had feared. There were chemical burns, angry red welts along Ava's arms, patches of raw skin behind her knees, tiny splatters on her neck. The ER doctor shook his head. Old and new injuries. Some of these could be days old. And look at the bruising. Upper arms, back, face. This wasn't a one-time thing. The chemical smell still clung to Ava's bag, even as it was zipped into a hazardous materials bin. The doctor ordered a blood panel, and Julia saw the unease ripple through the staff as the preliminary results came in. Trace amounts of hazardous solvents, the kind used in industry, had seeped into Ava's bloodstream. Julia's radio squawked. She stepped into the hall, tension mounting. "Tran, be advised," came the dispatcher's voice. "There's a man in the waiting area demanding to see a little girl brought in this morning. Says his name is Greg Walters. Claims to be her father." The name sent a chill through Julia. She moved quickly, hand brushing her holster, Atlas close at her side. As they rounded the corner, Julia saw him, a big man in work boots and a flannel jacket, soaked through, face red with anger. He shoved past a security guard, roaring, "That's my daughter! I want to see her now! You cops don't know what you're doing! She belongs with me!" Atlas lunged, placing himself directly between Greg and the ER doors. He bared his teeth, hackles up, a warning growl rumbling low. Greg froze, hand half raised, mouth twisted in a snarl. Julia planted herself between Greg and the door. "Step back, sir. You can't be in here. Your daughter is being treated. We'll speak to you after the doctors finish." Greg glared, fists clenched. "You think you're helping her? She needs her family. You're scaring her." Atlas let out another deep growl, never blinking. Greg hesitated, anger warring with a flicker of fear. A second security guard appeared, more hospital staff closing in. "I'm calling my lawyer," Greg shouted, backing away but never taking his eyes off Julia or Atlas. He stormed out, pushing the door open with a crash. The hallway went quiet, but for the static on Julia's radio and the faint echo of Ava's sobbing from down the corridor. Back in the ER bay, the atmosphere had shifted. Ava sat propped up in bed, hospital gown hanging loose on her bony shoulders. Every time a nurse spoke too loudly or a metal tray clattered, she recoiled, shrinking into Atlas. The dog's steady breathing and warm weight were the only things keeping her anchored. When food arrived, a bowl of oatmeal, apple slices, Ava stared at it without moving. A nurse tried coaxing her, but she wouldn't take a bite until Atlas nudged the tray with his nose, then licked a piece of apple from her hand. Only then did Ava eat, each motion hesitant, as if expecting punishment. Julia sat beside the bed, notebook open, pen tapping nervously. She spoke softly. "Ava, can you tell me about what happened? About your dad?" The question brought a visible shiver, Ava's gaze locking on the floor. "He gets mad," she whispered, voice almost gone. "Don't make him mad." Julia exchanged glances with the doctor. There was more here, layers of harm, fear, and silence. But even as Ava retreated into herself, she never let go of Atlas. A nurse returned, holding a chart. "We found hazardous solvents on her clothes and in her blood. This is bad, Julia. She's been exposed for a while." Before Julia could respond, her phone buzzed. Hospital security had just checked the parking lot. Greg's truck was still there. Inside, several canisters marked with the same industrial warnings as Ava's backpack. Julia's gut twisted. This wasn't just neglect. This was criminal endangerment and something else, something organized, a pattern. As the evening deepened, Ava's vital signs stabilized. She drifted in and out of sleep. Atlas pressed at her side, refusing to move even when nurses begged. In those moments, Julia watched the girl and the dog, their bond wordless but absolute. But beneath the hospital's fluorescent lights, Julia felt the shadow of the man in the hallway, and the chemicals on Ava's skin, and the bruises that told stories no child should ever live through. She made a silent vow. She would not let this case go cold. She would fight for Ava, no matter how many doors she had to break through, no matter how many men like Greg Walters tried to stand in her way. As Atlas raised his head, staring out the window into the stormy night, Julia felt the weight of what was coming, the threat still lurking outside, closer than anyone dared to admit. Night in the pediatric wing was a hush of distant voices and the steady beep of machines. Julia remained in a visitor chair, stiff with exhaustion but unable to leave. The storm had moved on, leaving the windows beaded with silver, and for a rare moment, Cedar Glen felt quiet, except for the secrets that still clung to the girl sleeping beside Atlas. Ava drifted between shallow sleep and anxious waking. Her hand stayed tangled in the thick fur at Atlas's shoulder, even when she whimpered from some nightmare, and Atlas pressed closer, breathing slow and patient. Julia watched this small ritual, the way the child's fist would clench when the memories returned, how Atlas's weight steadied her. It was a language beyond words, a kind of trust built in the ruins of hurt. In the soft pool of light from her phone, Julia opened her notebook and drew. Years on the force had taught her to sketch out cases, witness maps, timeline arrows, lists of evidence. Tonight, her hands remembered an older habit. She sketched the curve of Ava's head bowed into Atlas, the arch of the dog's back as he guarded her, the uncertain slant of the girl's shoulders. The lines came out raw and heavy. She remembered her own childhood then, the years spent in a house where silence was safety. She could still hear the sound of her mother's voice, always just above a whisper, and the footsteps of an uncle who never got in trouble. Not even when Julia tried to speak up. He worked at the factory, like everyone else in their neighborhood. "We take care of our own," her mother used to say. But Julia knew that wasn't always true. Some wounds never got seen, let alone healed. The door eased open. Layla Gomez from Child Protective Services entered, tall, black-haired, wearing tired eyes and a cardigan that had seen too many long nights. She nodded at Julia, lowering her voice. "How's she doing?" Julia nodded toward the bed. "Restless. She won't let go of Atlas. Refuses to sleep unless he's there." Layla glanced at the dog, a faint smile flickering. "He's got good instincts." Julia watched as Layla checked Ava's chart, fingers gentle, her words even softer. "We ran her information through our database. Ava's mother, Marissa Walters, disappeared last year. She filed a complaint about chemical exposure at North Bend Freight. Claimed it was making kids in their neighborhood sick. Then she went off the radar. Neighbors said she left during a storm, took a suitcase, and was never seen again." Julia's throat tightened. "So it's just Ava and Greg?" "For now." Layla's face was grave. "But there are too many questions. The chemicals, the burns, the bruises. We can't send Ava home." Ava stirred, eyes fluttering open. She scanned the room in a panic until she saw Atlas. The dog gave a slow wag, then nudged her arm with his nose. Ava's mouth moved. She whispered so softly only Atlas heard, her lips pressed to his ear. Julia couldn't catch the words, but she saw Atlas's eyes close, his big frame settling as if to reassure her. "I'm not going anywhere." Layla sat beside Julia. "You ever seen a bond like that?" Julia shook her head. "It's different. She trusts him more than anyone here. More than herself." The room filled with small, careful moments. Ava sketching stick figures on the hospital's notepad. Atlas licking her fingers clean after a snack. Julia watching every shadow that passed the door. The night passed in this cycle of silence and gentle gestures. Later, as the fluorescent lights flickered low, Ava's voice came out thin and small. "Will Atlas stay and protect my dreams?" Her eyes were wide and searching. Julia blinked back an ache in her chest. She crouched by the bed, meeting the child's gaze. "I promise, I'll stay right here with you, and so will Atlas." She wanted to say more, to promise that nothing bad could ever happen again. But she knew too well that wasn't how the world worked. Atlas lifted his head, resting it in Ava's lap. She stroked his ears, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. "He always knows when I'm scared." Julia nodded, thinking of her own son, of the nights he'd curled up with his old stuffed dog after her husband's accident, refusing to let anyone but Julia near him. She remembered every time she'd wished for someone to break through her silence, to see the wounds inside. A nurse brought in a new blanket, soft and pale blue, tucking it around Ava's shoulders. The little girl smiled shyly, for the first time all night. Layla handed Julia a stack of intake forms. "We're going to need to find a safe place for her," she murmured, "but she's not ready. Maybe she never will be. These kids, they get lost in the system unless someone fights for them." Julia stared at the forms, her pen hesitating. "We can't just hand her over to strangers." Layla sighed, exhaustion in every line. "Sometimes that's all we can do, Julia, unless there's family, or someone willing to go the extra mile." Julia's mind wandered to the industrial accident that took her husband, a disaster no one at the factory would talk about, the truth buried beneath settlements and fear. She saw herself in Ava, both of them survivors, both carrying wounds no one else could see. Before dawn, Ava drew a picture with the nurse's pens, a woman, a dog, a sun behind dark clouds. She handed it to Julia with a tiny, trembling hand. "That's my mom," she whispered. She said, "Never let the dark win." Julia tucked the drawing into her pocket, near her own worn family photo. She met Ava's gaze, steady and sure. "I won't." Outside, the sky turned from charcoal to slate, a pale hint of hope behind the rain. In the quiet before shift change, Julia laid her hand atop Atlas's massive head and closed her eyes. She vowed that whatever it took, rules bent, risks taken, sleepless nights, she would not let Ava slip into silence. She would not be a bystander to another story of harm, another child failed by the world's indifference. Ava's breathing slowed, finally falling into a deeper sleep. Atlas stretched, sighing as if he understood the weight of the promise. Julia whispered, "We're not alone anymore. Not tonight. Not ever again." Morning light filtered through clouded glass as Julia sat in her patrol car outside the small, peeling rental house that Ava had called home. It was on the edge of Cedar Glen, wedged between a long-abandoned grocery and the chain-link fence of an old freight yard. Atlas sat quietly beside her, nose twitching at every scent on the wind. The world looked unchanged, but nothing felt the same. Julia's mind replayed Ava's drawings, the fresh bruises, the burned chemical labels, details that now formed the shape of a nightmare she refused to ignore. She tightened her vest and stepped out. The air smelled of rain and motor oil, of wild grass and secrets. Atlas stayed pressed to her thigh, silent but alert, as Julia crossed the cracked front walk. The paint flaked from the doorframe, and the porch sagged beneath her boots. She knocked, announced herself, and waited. No answer. The neighbor's blinds twitched. Julia eased the door open. The house was dim and stale, the faint sting of chemicals sharp in the air. The living room was cluttered but not lived in, mail tossed on a table, faded family photos stuffed in a crooked frame, a child's crayon drawing half torn above the mantel. The TV blinked static in the corner. Atlas padded ahead, sniffing each corner with deliberate focus. He paused at a hallway, nose working, then glanced at Julia as if asking for permission. She nodded. They moved deeper. The kitchen was worse. Empty cans stacked in the sink, a bucket marked with hazard warnings shoved beneath the table, a pair of gloves crusted with residue beside a half-eaten sandwich. Julia took photos, heart pounding with every new discovery. A soft noise caught her ear, a neighbor's cat darting past the back window, followed by the metallic rattle of wind through the fence. Atlas stiffened and turned toward a door at the end of the hall. It was locked. Julia tried the knob, found it stuck, and leaned her shoulder against it until the wood gave way with a reluctant groan. Inside, the air was colder. Shelves lined one wall, stacked with dusty boxes and toolkits. In the corner, hidden behind a laundry basket, were 3 plastic drums. Each bore the same industrial labels she'd seen on Ava's backpack: corrosive, toxic, flammable. Julia snapped pictures, her anger simmering. Atlas nosed around, then began pawing at a spot on the closet floor. Julia crouched, pushed aside a loose board, and found a folded paper beneath. A child's drawing. It showed a woman and a dog, hands clasped, with a message scrawled in shaky print: "Don't forget me, Mom." The paper was old and soft at the edges, colors faded but the hope still raw. Julia closed her eyes. She thought of Ava's voice in the hospital, so small and desperate. Something in her chest ached. Atlas pawed at the board again, finding a scrap of blue fabric, a sleeve from a woman's blouse. Julia collected it for evidence, the questions mounting. Returning to the kitchen, she scanned for more. On the back door, she noticed a work jacket draped over a chair, stained, its breast pocket stitched with a patch from North Bend Freight. Greg's initials were written on the label. Julia bagged it, heart racing. A knock startled her. She turned to see a woman from next door, hair gray, sweater stretched thin. Her eyes flicked between Julia and Atlas. "You the officer who found Ava?" Julia nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I need to ask you a few questions." The woman lingered in the doorway, nervously twisting her hands. "I seen things, heard fights. Poor kid, always so quiet." Her mama. She left one night in a storm, suitcase in hand, looked scared out of her mind, didn't say goodbye, just vanished. After that, I didn't see Ava much. Greg would be out late. People from the yard came and went, sometimes real late, hauling boxes. "Did you ever hear where Marissa, Ava's mom, went?" The woman shook her head. She said she'd had enough, that she was going to tell somebody what was happening at the yard. Next day, she was gone. Julia thanked her, noted every word. Her notebook was filling with the stories people told only when they thought nobody was listening. Back at the squad car, Julia's hands shook as she organized evidence. Photos, drawings, the fabric scrap, all pointed to a family broken by something far larger than a single man's anger. The patterns were emerging. Chemical leaks, silence, fear. She remembered her own guilt, the times she hadn't spoken up for her son when teachers turned away, or how she had let her husband's case fade after the accident, afraid of crossing the powerful men at the mill. Atlas watched her, eyes steady, as if to say, "You can't let this one go." At the station, she filed her report and began searching North Bend Freight's records. Warehouse logs revealed Greg's name tied to late-night shipments, including one marked for disposal, the same night as a fire had gutted a corner of the yard. Julia cross-referenced chemical deliveries with Ava's injuries. Patterns emerged. Greg's shifts, missing safety checks, whistleblowers reassigned or fired. Late that night, Julia returned home. Exhausted, she emptied her mailbox and found a single envelope. No return address. Inside was a note, each word carved in anger. "Drop it, or you'll regret it." She stared at the threat, the weight of it heavy in her palm. Atlas pressed his head against her leg, sensing the shift in her mood. Julia looked at the dark sky through her window. She thought of Ava, of Marissa's vanished hope, of the silent ghosts in every neglected house and abandoned yard. And she made her decision. She would not drop it. She would not let another story end in shadows. The days blurred into one another as Cedar Glen's summer sun burned through the haze. But inside the quiet rooms of foster care, Ava's world had shrunk to walls, whispers, and the silent ache of missing Atlas. Julia knew the system well, knew how a child, already broken by betrayal, could vanish into its paperwork and routines, trust fraying with every day she waited for someone familiar. But this case wouldn't leave her. Every night, Julia sat at her kitchen table with the threat note in front of her, the family photos, and her own grief crowding her memory. Ava's nightmares grew worse. The foster family, kind but overwhelmed, called Julia in desperation after one too many nights of screaming and sleeplessness. "She barely speaks," the foster mother whispered into the phone. "She cries for that dog. It's the only time she's calm, when she's drawing him or clutching that blanket he slept on." Julia felt the weight of her badge, of her promise. She could have walked away. Most officers would have, once the child was safe. Instead, she went to court. The request was unusual. A police K-9 allowed to visit a traumatized child in foster care. The judge, an old man with more compassion than most, reviewed the file, the photos, and Julia's trembling voice as she spoke of Ava's fear, of the night she'd found her shivering in the mist. "Permission granted," he finally ruled, "but only under your supervision, Officer Tran. And keep the visits regular. This child deserves some measure of peace." The next morning, Julia drove Atlas to the foster house. He sat poised and alert in the passenger seat, muzzle streaked with gray, eyes never leaving the door. The moment Ava saw him, every muscle in her body loosened. She flung herself into his arms, clutching his fur, sobbing, but for the first time they were tears of relief and not terror. Ava buried her face against Atlas's chest, her voice breaking. "Atlas never leaves me in the dark." Julia watched as the dog curled himself around the girl, his large body making a shield against every shadow that tried to enter. For the first time, Ava spoke to Julia directly. Her voice was soft, each word deliberate, as if testing whether the world would actually listen. "Why did my dad hurt me?" she asked. "Why does nobody believe me when I say I'm scared?" Julia took a long, steadying breath, thinking of her own story, the years after her husband's accident at the mill, the way nobody at the factory would answer her questions, how her grief had turned into silence. "Sometimes people want to pretend things aren't as bad as they are," she told Ava gently. "Sometimes the truth is too hard for them to hear. But you're not alone. Not anymore." The next day, Layla from CPS called. "We've tracked something unusual," she said, voice urgent. "Ava's mother, Marissa, might not be dead. There's evidence she took a bus north, Montana maybe. We found a trail of hospital records under a new name, but the birth date and details match. We think she's in hiding." Julia felt the pieces click. She asked for permission to investigate, her tone steely. Layla hesitated. "You're bending the rules, Julia. If you're wrong—" "I'm not," Julia said. "Marissa ran because she was scared for her life. Ava needs her mother, and someone needs to end this cycle." Before she left, Julia sat with Ava one last time. The girl handed her a drawing, a woman, a child, and a dog, holding hands beneath a sky full of rain and sun. "If you find my mom, will you tell her I didn't forget?" Ava whispered. Julia squeezed her hand. "I promise. And Atlas will be with you every step." Late that night, Julia finally opened up to Layla, letting her guard down more than she had in years. She told the story of losing her husband, the day he didn't come home, the accident report full of contradictions, the way people looked at her like she was asking for trouble. "I tried to fight," Julia admitted, "but sometimes the whole town seems built on secrets nobody wants exposed." Layla listened, tears in her eyes. You're not alone either, Julia. Maybe this is how we start changing things. Determined, Julia dug into North Bend Freight's payroll records, finally finding a clue. A wire transfer to a Montana women's shelter. A note about relocation assistance. The name was different, but the handwriting on the form was Marissa's. She wasn't dead. She'd been driven into hiding, threatened into silence, just like Julia had been, just like Ava. A week passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls, but then Julia got the confirmation she needed. Marissa was alive. She'd changed her name, moved to a remote shelter, and left her old life behind to save her child. But she was still afraid, still running. Julia packed her bag, heart pounding with the enormity of what she was about to do. She called Layla, who promised to watch over Ava and Atlas. Before she left, Julia returned to the foster house for one last visit. Ava waited by the window, tracing Atlas's silhouette onto the fogged glass. When Julia entered, the girl wrapped her arms around her waist, holding tight. Atlas nuzzled her hand, eyes full of understanding. "You'll bring my mom back?" Ava whispered, barely audible. Julia knelt, hand resting on the girl's shoulder. "I'll try my very best, Ava. That's a promise from me. And from Atlas, too." Outside, the summer air felt heavy with possibility and danger. Julia looked back once, seeing Ava and Atlas together, two souls battered by the world, but refusing to let it define them. In her chest, Julia felt something unfamiliar, hope, sharp and real. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she believed it could be won. A week later, Julia found herself gripping the steering wheel, the landscape of Oregon giving way to the wild, open spaces of northern Montana. Atlas rode beside her, his head turned to the open window, nose tasting the wind, eyes never at rest. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the endless fields gold and red, but Julia's mind ran dark with questions and resolve. Her official leave slip said, "Personal family business." It was only half a lie. This felt more like family than any duty she'd ever had. Cedar Glen felt 1,000 miles behind her, but the weight of Ava's eyes, the trembling in her voice, kept Julia pushing forward mile after mile. The shelter was hidden behind a grove of aspens on the edge of a tiny town. Julia parked far away and walked the last 100 yards, Atlas trotting by her side, his big body blocking the world's dangers. Her heart hammered as she approached the weathered building, its sign sun-bleached and chipped, Haven for Hope. She stepped into the cool, dim lobby, the air smelling faintly of coffee, soap, and old pain. The woman at the desk, short, silver-haired, tired, looked up with wary suspicion. "Can I help you?" Julia lowered her voice, speaking carefully. "I'm looking for Marissa Walters. It's about her daughter, Ava. Please, I'm not here to cause trouble." There was a long silence. The woman's eyes searching Julia's face, then Atlas's gentle, watchful posture. "Wait here," she said. "She doesn't talk to strangers." Minutes ticked by. Julia stroked Atlas's head, feeling the old ache of helplessness she'd known too well as a child, waiting for adults to decide her fate. Finally, the woman returned with someone behind her, a thin figure, dark hair streaked with gray, face half in shadow, movements small and careful. Marissa. She stopped in the doorway, clinging to its frame as if bracing for bad news. Her eyes, Ava's eyes, darted from Julia to Atlas, then back again. There was an instant of fear, then something else. Hope, raw and dangerous. Is Ava all right?" Marissa's voice cracked. Julia nodded, voice gentle. She's safe. She's asking for you. She misses you every day. Marissa pressed a hand to her mouth, tears running down her face. Atlas, as if understanding the moment, padded forward and sat at her feet, gently resting his head in her lap. The dam broke. Marissa sobbed, hands tangled in Atlas's fur, every wound surfacing after months of silence. Julia crouched beside her, not saying a word, only placing a hand on Marissa's trembling shoulder. After a long while, Marissa composed herself, wiping her face with shaking fingers. I tried to tell them about the chemicals, about the danger at North Bend. They threatened me, told me if I talked to the press or the police, Ava would pay the price. Greg, he did things to scare me. I thought disappearing was the only way to keep her safe. But it never felt right. Leaving her behind. Julia's throat tightened. You did what you had to, but now you can help her, and maybe stop them for good. Marissa nodded slowly, then drew a battered folder from her bag. Inside were handwritten statements, photographs, and copies of documents. Evidence of North Bend's illegal chemical dumps, employee injuries, cover-ups, and even the threats she'd received. Julia scanned the pages, heart racing. It was enough to blow the case open, if they could make it back to Oregon alive. You'll testify? Julia asked quietly. If it keeps Ava safe, yes, Marissa replied, voice steadying. But they'll come after us. They always do. Julia looked to Atlas, who sat tall and steady, as if promising that nothing would touch them on his watch. You're not alone, not this time. They left the shelter at dawn, driving west through lonely highways and mountain passes. Marissa dozed fitfully in the back seat, clutching her folder, while Atlas kept watch, shifting his gaze to every approaching car. Julia drove in silence, her mind swirling with plans and fear. Every mile home felt heavier, every shadow in the rearview mirror sharper. Halfway to the Oregon border, Julia noticed a dark SUV trailing behind them, keeping its distance. Her chest tightened. She changed lanes, took an unexpected exit, but the vehicle followed, headlights dim in the pre-dawn gloom. Atlas shifted, hackles rising, a low warning rumble in his chest. Julia reached under her seat for her service weapon, eyes fixed on the road, mind calculating the risks. She sped up, heart pounding, then turned sharply onto a gravel road leading into a thick stand of pines. The SUV hesitated, then pulled off the highway, creeping after them. Julia parked suddenly, spinning the wheel so the car blocked the narrow road. Atlas braced himself, eyes locked on the dark vehicle. Marissa ducked low, clutching the evidence. The SUV stopped 100 feet behind. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just engines humming, wind stirring the trees. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, face hidden by sunglasses and a ball cap. He stood just watching, as if weighing his options. Julia tensed, hand on her weapon. Atlas bared his teeth, a deep growl vibrating through the car. The man paused, then, as if thinking better of it, got back into the SUV. Tires spat gravel as he sped off into the trees, disappearing into the mist. Julia let out a shaky breath. Marissa sobbed softly, her whole body trembling. Atlas licked Marissa's hand and leaned in, calm and unmovable. We're almost home, Julia whispered. Just a little further. As dawn broke, their car crossed back into Oregon, the sky streaked pink and gold. Julia kept one hand on the wheel and the other close to the folder of evidence. Atlas, vigilant as ever, pressed his side to Marissa's leg. The lines they'd crossed could never be uncrossed. But for the first time, Julia felt the ground shifting. fear giving way to a fragile kind of hope. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. Returning to Cedar Glen should have felt like coming home, but the air was different. Charged, restless, thick with the scent of smoke and old secrets. Julia's phone buzzed with new messages before she'd even turned onto Main Street. She barely had time to drop Marissa off with Layla at a safe house before the warnings escalated. Her house had always been a refuge. White siding, flower beds, faded wind chimes. But now its windows seemed to stare back, wary and uncertain. Julia drove up the cracked driveway and immediately noticed something off. The mailbox hung open, the porch light shattered. On her doormat, someone had left a single work glove, slick with an oily residue. North Bend Freight's logo was stamped on the cuff. Atlas sniffed it, ears back, growl deep and low. Inside, Julia checked every room. Drawers had been pulled out. Family photos scattered on the floor. On her fridge, black marker letters spelled out, "Quit while you can." She sat at her kitchen table, chest tight, trying to steady her breathing as she dialed Layla. "Security's tight here," Layla assured her. "But be careful. We've alerted the sheriff's office. They've put a car on your street for the night." The relief was short-lived. As darkness fell, Julia received a series of anonymous calls. First a silent line, then a raspy voice. "We know where the girl is. Walk away, or she gets burned too." The threat was so direct that Julia felt it like a knife pressed to her ribs. She barely slept. Atlas paced the floor, restless, always pausing at the window, his body tense. Just after midnight, her phone buzzed again, this time from Ava's foster mother. Julia answered, already on her feet. "There's smoke, Julia. The house. It smells like something's burning." She didn't wait for the full sentence. Julia raced outside, Atlas leaping into the squad car with her, sirens wailing. The summer air shimmered with heat. When she arrived, fire trucks were already on scene. The Foster family huddled on the curb, faces streaked with soot and panic. But Ava was missing. A firefighter ran up, voice tight. "We can't find her. Last we saw, she was upstairs, maybe hiding, maybe trapped." Atlas lunged against his leash, dragging Julia toward the burning house. His body stiffened, nose to the ground, tracking through smoke and chaos. Julia shouted to the fire chief, "Let us in! He'll find her! He can do it!" The chief hesitated, then nodded. 30 seconds. Go!" Inside, heat pressed in from all sides. Smoke turning the hallway into a shifting, deadly maze. Atlas kept his nose low, muscles bunching, barking once, sharp, insistent. Julia dropped to her knees, crawling after him through the blackness. She heard the faintest whimper, a child's voice. Then Atlas's answering bark. He found Ava in the bathtub, a wet towel over her face, shaking but alive. Julia scooped Ava into her arms, racing out just as flames licked across the ceiling. Outside, the paramedics wrapped Ava in blankets, checking her for burns and smoke inhalation. She clung to Atlas, refusing to let go. The firefighters called them heroes, but Julia barely heard. Her hands trembled as she hugged Ava tight. This was no longer just a case. This was war. The police combed the scene. In the alley behind the house, they found a broken bottle, a burnt rag, a crude Molotov cocktail. Witnesses had seen a man in a work jacket running away, face hidden by a cap. Julia knew who it was before the lab confirmed the fingerprints. Greg Walters, and one of North Bend Freight's private security men. Julia sat in the ambulance, Ava pressed against her side, Atlas's big head in her lap. The moment felt endless. Ava's heart beat frantic beneath her fingers. When Ava finally spoke, her voice was a whisper. "They tried to get me, Julia. I was so scared. Atlas found me. You're safe now, Julia promised, her own voice shaky. By morning, the town was buzzing. The sheriff's office moved Ava and her foster family to a secure location. The hospital kept Marissa under watch, guarded by off-duty deputies. Julia barely paused. She collected the evidence, the chemical bottles, the phone threats, and drove straight to the courthouse. Detectives had been intercepting texts between Greg and North Bend's head of security, detailing plans to make witnesses disappear and end the problem for good. Julia handed over Marissa's folder of evidence, her own reports, and the results from the arson scene. The DA acted quickly. Arrest warrants were issued. Greg was picked up at a motel outside town, and the security chief was cuffed at North Bend's offices. All night, Julia fielded calls from reporters and townspeople. Some left flowers on her porch. Others just nodded solemnly as she walked through town. Her hands shook every time she touched her keys or looked over her shoulder. But beneath it all, something new was growing. A citywide alarm, yes, but also a kind of unity. People wanted answers. They wanted justice. Julia and Atlas drove past the charred skeleton of the foster house at dawn, smoke curling into the sky. The town was changed. Afraid, yes, but awake. No more secrets in the shadows. At a traffic light, Ava, safe in the back seat with her foster mother, caught Julia's eye in the mirror. Her small hand reached through the cage, resting on Atlas's fur. He looked back at her, his eyes soft, his whole body promising protection. Julia's heart swelled with fear, hope, and the weight of all she'd risked. For the first time, she let herself believe they could really make it through, that the fight, messy and dangerous, was finally turning in their favor. As Atlas leaned against her, steady as the sunrise, Julia whispered, "We're not done yet, partner. Not until they're all safe." The courthouse in Cedar Glen stood like a fortress at the edge of the square. Old brick, heavy doors, flags fluttering in the late summer sun. That morning, the whole town buzzed with a strange energy, whispers darting from the cafe to the hardware store. Word had spread. The Walters case was going public. Julia walked up the courthouse steps, Atlas at her side, feeling the weight of every eye. For the first time, Ava and Marissa were together again, both clinging to Atlas for courage. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Reporters, neighbors, off-duty cops, union workers from North Bend Freight, and a row of stern-faced officials from the district attorney's office. At the front, Judge Michaels adjusted his glasses, scanning the room for order. Julia took her place near Marissa and Ava. The girl gripped Atlas's collar, her small hand buried in his fur. The dog's calm, steady presence grounded them all, his quiet strength impossible to ignore. Marissa trembled, but lifted her chin, holding her daughter's hand in both of hers. Julia caught Marissa's eye, a silent promise of support. Greg Walters was led in, handcuffed, eyes hard and flat, flanked by lawyers. North Bend's security chief sat a few rows behind, pale and tense. Testimony began with evidence. Photos of Ava's injuries, the chemical drums, medical reports. Julia stood, her uniform pressed, voice steady as she described the night she found Ava in the rain. She told the story, not as an officer, but as someone who had once been a powerless child herself. "Sometimes the world is too loud for the quiet ones," she said, glancing at Ava. "Sometimes we have to fight so they don't disappear." The DA presented Marissa's folder, chemical records, whistleblower threats, proof of company cover-ups. The courtroom fell silent as Marissa testified, voice shaking at first, but gaining strength. "I tried to warn them," she said, hands white-knuckled. "I tried to protect my child, but no one listened until it was almost too late." When it was Ava's turn, Julia felt her own hands sweat. The little girl clung to Atlas as she walked to the witness stand. The courtroom hushed to a heartbeat. She looked so small, but her eyes held a strange, ancient steadiness. "Do you know who hurt you, Ava?" the prosecutor asked gently. Ava nodded, voice almost too soft to hear. "My dad, and the man from the yard. They said if I told anyone, they'd take my mom away forever." "And what about Atlas? Why is he important to you?" Ava pressed her face into the dog's fur, her words trembling but true. "He keeps me safe. He always comes when I'm scared. He never leaves me alone." A collective hush rippled through the room. Even the judge seemed to blink away something in his eyes. The defense tried to rattle Ava, but Atlas's presence was a silent shield. He didn't growl or bark. He simply sat between Ava and the men who'd hurt her, unmoving. It was enough. Julia took the stand again, this time talking about advocacy, about her own pain and what it means to protect the voiceless. She described the culture of silence in Cedar Glen, how systems can fail, and why ordinary people have to stand up. She saw heads nodding, hands gripping tissues, the slow awakening of a town once content to look away. The closing arguments were fierce. North Bend's lawyers painting a picture of misunderstanding, Greg's attorney claiming stress and concern for his daughter. But no one in that room could forget Ava's bruises, Marissa's tears, or the way Atlas had saved lives. More than once. When the verdict came, the room held its breath. Judge Michael's voice was firm. "Greg Walters, you are found guilty of child endangerment, abuse, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. You are hereby sentenced to prison. North Bend Freight is fined for environmental violations and reckless endangerment, and required to fund community restitution. Marissa Walters is granted full custody of Ava. This court acknowledges the heroic actions of Officer Julia Tran and her K-9 partner Atlas, whose courage and persistence protected the innocent." Applause broke out. First a hesitant ripple, then a wave. Reporters scribbled furiously. Julia hugged Marissa, who broke down in her arms. Ava ran to Atlas, burying her face in his side, and for the first time she smiled, a real, unafraid smile. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Townspeople who had looked away for too long now stood with signs cheering for Ava, Marissa, Julia, and Atlas. A local news van beamed the scene across the region. Later that afternoon, the governor's office called. State investigators would review North Bend's past incidents. Reform bills were being drafted. The story had grown larger than Cedar Glen, sparked by one frightened girl, a mother's sacrifice, and a dog who never backed down. That evening, as the sky deepened to violet, Julia walked with Ava, Marissa, and Atlas down Main Street. The town felt changed, braver, kinder, with a little less darkness in the corners. Ava clutched Julia's hand, Marissa close by, Atlas leading the way with his head high. For a moment they all paused outside the bakery, where townspeople waited to give Ava a chocolate chip cookie for being the bravest girl in Cedar Glen. Ava's eyes shone, Atlas's tail wagged, and Julia finally let herself exhale. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a reckoning. It was hope made visible, a town transformed by truth, a family rebuilt by courage, a child who could finally step into the light. Several months slipped by, each one bringing its own slow miracle. The shadows that once clung to Cedar Glen's corners receded, replaced by the honest chatter of neighbors in grocery lines, the sound of laughter echoing across the playground at Town Hall, and a subtle but real sense of change. Some scars remained, on the town, on Marissa and Ava, even on Julia herself, but healing had found its first foothold. Julia and Atlas became regular guests at Marissa and Ava's small, sunlit apartment, not far from Cedar Glen's main street. The place was simple: second-hand furniture, a jumble of children's books, a corkboard crowded with crayon drawings. But it was filled with warmth. Every wall told a new story. Julia often came in uniform, sometimes off-duty, always welcomed with Ava's shy smile and Marissa's coffee. Ava was different now. Where she once flinched at every sudden noise or shadow, she had begun to move through the world with curiosity. She started school that fall, clutching a purple backpack and Atlas's leash, granted special permission by the principal to have her protector walk her to class on rough days. The other kids, at first unsure, soon became her allies. Ava was quick with a joke, shy but kind, and she always stood up for anyone smaller or lonelier than herself. More than once, Julia caught her comforting new classmates with the same calm she'd once needed so badly herself. Marissa, too, was building a life she thought she'd lost. She found part-time work at a nearby clinic, joined a support group, and painted in the evenings. Most nights, the apartment was filled with music and the hum of conversation. Sometimes, as dusk fell, Marissa and Ava would sit on the porch, Atlas at their feet, and watch the world move on, finally able to breathe again. But healing, Julia realized, was not just about peace. It was about facing what had come before. There were nights when Ava still woke crying, nightmares pulling her back to burning houses or the dark trunk of Greg's pickup. Julia was always there on those nights, Atlas at her side, soothing Ava's fears. And Marissa, sometimes caught in her own storms of guilt and memory, would call Julia to talk through her fears, the worry that the past might one day return. One Saturday morning, the community center held an art class for kids and their families. Julia sat in the back, sketchbook in hand, while Ava worked quietly on a mural, a sweeping panorama of Cedar Glen, with mountains and wildflowers, and in the center, a brown-haired girl and a big German shepherd standing side by side. Above them, Ava carefully wrote in bright blue paint, "The one who stayed." When she finished, she invited Julia and Atlas to join her in front of the mural for a photo, her arm around Atlas's neck. For the first time, the camera caught Ava grinning, her eyes wide open to the world. Later that day, Julia sat at her kitchen table, journal open, words flowing in slow, careful script. Healing isn't forgetting. It's what happens when truth finds a safe place to grow. She thought about all they'd endured, the nights of fear, the fights for justice, the aching weight of being unheard. But she also thought of how far they'd come. She saw Ava's resilience, Marissa's strength, and even her own transformation. Julia no longer felt like the little girl who'd grown up in silence, nor the widow who'd been shamed for asking questions. She was something new, someone who knew the cost of pain, but also the value of standing up. Marissa's case, and the reforms that followed, became a catalyst for Cedar Glen. At school board meetings, parents spoke up about safety and support. The town council pushed for stricter oversight of local industries, insisting on transparency. Even the sheriff's office changed. New officers trained in trauma response, and Julia herself leading workshops about advocacy for the voiceless. One afternoon, Ava approached Julia as she watched Atlas napping in the sun. "Do you think we'll ever be completely okay?" she asked, voice full of hope and worry. Julia knelt, meeting her eyes. "I think we already are, in ways that matter. Being okay doesn't mean nothing hurts. It means we keep growing, even with the scars." Ava nodded, thoughtful, then grinned. Can I teach Atlas to paint? Julia laughed, the sound bright and honest. If anyone can, it's you. As autumn colored the maples red and gold, Cedar Glen celebrated Ava's mural with a community potluck. Marissa stood before the crowd, voice steady, as she thanked everyone who had helped. Julia watched as the townspeople listened, truly listened, seeing both Marissa and Ava not as victims, but as survivors and leaders. Afterwards, Julia found a quiet moment on the porch with her old family photo, her journal, and Atlas at her feet. She wrote, "This story is about more than justice or survival. It's about the courage to tell the truth, to protect the vulnerable, and to believe against all odds that love can remake the world." Cedar Glen wasn't perfect. No place was, but now the people in its streets and homes shared a new understanding. The lesson was written in every mural, every meeting, every small act of kindness. Systems can fail, but people, when they choose courage, empathy, and action, can change everything. The journey wasn't over for any of them. But as Julia watched Ava race across the grass, Atlas close behind, she saw not only healing, but hope. The kind of hope that comes only after surviving the storm and finding yourself finally in the light. Summer in Cedar Glen unfurled with a gentleness that felt almost impossible after everything that had happened. By late June, the town's river sparkled, the parks filled with laughter and music, and a soft breeze carried the scent of cut grass and wild roses through the streets. But for Julia, Marissa, Ava, and Atlas, the highlight was the annual Cedar Glen Summer Festival, a celebration of community, resilience, and, this year, new beginnings. The festival grounds were alive with color: striped tents, handmade banners, children running with painted faces, and booths offering everything from fresh lemonade to hand-woven baskets. It seemed as if the whole town had come out to honor not just the turning of the season, but the quiet victories of the past year. Word had spread. People knew what had happened, and they knew who had helped to set things right. On the main stage, near the edge of the green, Mayor Carmen Lynn took the microphone. She spoke about courage and community, about the necessity of hearing those who have been silenced, and then called up the group that had, in so many ways, become the heart of Cedar Glen's renewal. Please join me in honoring Marissa Walters and her daughter Ava, whose bravery inspired us all, Officer Julia Tran, who reminded us what it means to serve and protect, and of course Atlas, whose loyalty showed us what it means to never give up. A wave of applause swept across the crowd. Marissa, tears in her eyes, took Ava's hand and led her up the steps. Ava's cheeks were flushed with joy and nerves, but her posture was proud. Julia, in her dress uniform, stepped onto the stage with Atlas, who trotted confidently to Ava's side, his tail wagging, brown eyes shining in the sunlight. The mayor presented each of them with a plaque. Marissa clutched hers with trembling hands, while Ava buried her face in Atlas's fur, overwhelmed by the cheers. The moment was both grand and intimate, a small town recognizing the quiet heroism that often goes unseen. As the crowd quieted, Ava was handed the microphone. She paused, looking out at a sea of faces, neighbors, classmates, teachers, and strangers. Julia watched her, feeling her own heart thud with hope and pride. Atlas pressed his head into Ava's side, his silent strength radiating through her. Ava began to read a short poem she had written, her voice steady but soft. "Thank you for hearing me, for seeing me, for never leaving me alone. In every shadow, you brought me light. In every fear, you taught me hope. Because you listened, I am here." There was a hush, a single breath held by the whole town. Then, tears streaming down more than one face, the applause rose again, louder and longer than before. Later that day, Julia, Marissa, Ava, and Atlas wandered the festival together. They sampled homemade pies and watched fireworks being set up along the riverbank. Marissa laughed easily, her face more open and relaxed than Julia had ever seen. Ava joined a group of kids in a sack race, Atlas running alongside, barking with excitement. It was the ordinary magic of belonging, of safety earned and remade. As the sun began to set, Julia found herself standing apart for a moment, watching Ava and Atlas chase each other in the golden grass. Her hand rested on Marissa's shoulder. "She's free," Julia said quietly. "You both are." Marissa nodded, voice thick. "I never thought we'd see a day like this. I never thought there could be this much forgiveness or this much joy." Julia felt gratitude rise up in her, sharp and beautiful. She thought of all the sleepless nights, the fears she'd carried, the promises she'd made. She thought of her own son, now grown, and all the children and families she'd sworn to protect. And she thought of Atlas, steady and true, guiding them all through the darkest hours, as the festival's last fireworks exploded overhead, casting bursts of color across the river. Julia gathered everyone close. They watched in wonder, Marissa with her arm around Ava, Atlas pressed between them, his tail thumping quietly in the grass. Julia's thoughts turned reflective. She remembered the lessons etched in every part of their journey. The world is full of pain, but also full of people who can ease it. The voiceless are never truly alone, so long as even one person, and sometimes one remarkable dog, stands up for them. Justice takes courage, healing takes time, but hope, if nurtured, can return and bloom in the most unexpected places. Ava, sleepy and content, turned to Julia. "Do you think there will always be someone who listens?" Julia smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind Ava's ear. "As long as people remember this story, and as long as we remember to listen for the quiet voices, yes, I think there will be." The festival ended, but the feeling lingered. People stayed late, talking in soft clusters, their voices weaving through the summer night. Atlas led Ava and Julia down the path toward home, his steps light, his heart and theirs finally at peace. The next morning, Cedar Glen awoke to sunlight streaming through kitchen windows, the sounds of laughter in the street, and a new sense of possibility. The story of Ava, Marissa, Julia, and Atlas had become more than a headline. It was a reminder written into the life of the town. In every misty dawn, someone waits for rescue, and often, it's the quietest heroes who change the world.